Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. StoryTalk is a production of One Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs or support our work by visiting our Patreon page or by going to our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. I'm Ingrid Wenzler, here with al-Sirgany.
Hello.
And Matthew Schmidt.
Hello.
Today we'll be discussing His Mother's House from Lost in the City by Edward P. Jones, a collection that, like James Joyce's Dubliners, which Jones read and was taken with, focuses its attention on a city and its people. In Jones's case, the city is Washington, D.C. His Mother's House follows Joyce Moses, or Mama Joyce, as she's sometimes called. The opening lines of the story tell us that Santiago Moses has bought a house for his mother on 10th Street, and that one of the few things she's brought from the place she's left behind is a coffee table made of see-through glass and false wood. The coffee table and this new house on 10th Street are maybe not as much characters as Mama Joyce herself, Santiago, Ricky, Humphrey, Pearl, Adam, Joyce's mother, William, Smokey, Peebles, these characters that, though fictional, manage to give life to this story, make it feel so real and near to us. But both the coffee table and the house do come close to the world of the living, things animate and capable of acting on us. Jones's story in many ways structures itself around the two. Like many good stories, its plot proves difficult to summarize. It's a story with a past as present as it's present, and an uncertain, though certainly troubled, future. It's the story of intertwined characters and lives, how those characters care for and butt up against each other, and most significantly, it's the story of Humphrey's death. How and why Joyce's son Santiago shot him, how Joyce came to be holding him in his final moment. Matthew, Adam, since this story has such a large cast, I thought it might help listeners better follow us and what we have to say about this story if we take a moment to sort of list the story's main characters and draw a family tree for them. Would you two mind taking that on, and as you're doing so, taking note of how each character you're describing thinks about money? I see money and how we relate to it as one of this story's concerns.
Well, yeah. Let's see. The easiest way I think to do this is to say that Mama Joyce is friends with Pearl. So Pearl and Joyce are friends since they're like 10 years old. And the convenient way that Jones has kind of set this up is that they both have kids within like 3 weeks of each other or something like that. And so both Joyce's son, Santiago, and Pearl's son, Humphrey, are the same age. Joyce also has 2 other kids, Clovis and Taylor. They're much younger than Humphrey and Santiago. And Joyce is living with / seeing Ricky Madison. And Ricky Madison, we also learn, works as Santiago's driver. Adam is the child of a woman that Santiago is seeing, who also does Santiago's drugs. And Adam is left at Joyce's house at one point because this woman owes Santiago money, and Santiago somehow cares for Adam, is kind of the inference there. I don't know that we get a lot more than that. Like it's both payment and somehow Santiago has an attachment to Adam, I think, based on the story, though that isn't really laid out. I think those are the main characters, I would say, and concerning money, both Joyce and Pearl desire money and desire nice things. One of the things that is conveyed to us is that both of them had dreams of owning furniture that no one else has ever owned, right? So new things. Santiago cares about money insofar as he wants to give his mother nice things and also for his job. And that is as a dealer for Smokey. Smokey is the head honcho, and Santiago is his, quote, right-hand man. I think he also cares about money in that it gets him things, such as women, such as a Range Rover, such as a house. He can buy his siblings nice gifts. He buys Taylor a $300 bike at one point. And then there is Ricky, who actually also really likes money. Insofar as there's one point where there's a blow up because his car won't start and he's taking the family out for dinner. And Santiago gives him money to go find a cab after laughing at him. And Ricky getting mad at Santiago and telling Santiago he might not eat because he's going to have to pay to fix this car. And Santiago pulling out a bunch of money, giving it to him, and telling him to take a cab to work. And he's working construction at that point. Joyce's mother doesn't want anything to do with money, or at least money from Santiago from selling drugs. She would rather not be involved with that at all, and has even refused to live in the house Santiago bought Joyce because it's paid for with drug money.
Yeah, I think, Matthew, you covered, it's a long story, and it's a large, sometimes rambunctious cast. So I think I think you hit the main folks fairly well. While I might add to that, like, there are a number of sort of characters who play, they're offstage characters who I think inform us about money, or statements where we learn a little bit about money. So as I've interpreted this story, we are in DC sometime probably in the 90s, when DC is going through a real, like, crack epidemic. We don't really get that much information, in part because we're pretty close to Joyce's perspective the entire time in the story, and she's sort of willfully ignorant about where the cash is coming from, although so we don't get statements like he's selling crack, or he's selling crack and heroin, or what his role within sort of William Smokey Peoples' organization is.
Right.
And I think that's part of the weirdness here, right? Like, all of these folks are poor people, and so the kind of conspicuous affluence thing is really appealing, but I think all of them sort of imagine what it is to be wealthy or stable or comfortable slightly differently. So Joyce's common law husband, Ricky, we get a little flashback moment where he describes himself as a family man without a family. And so he is, throughout the story, trying to have a child with Joyce, which we get a little insight into her inability to do that because she's had her tubes tied a little bit later, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But I think he does, to Matthew's point, take on that father role and that head of the house role. So there's this odd shift within the family that we don't get a lot of exploring about, where Santiago's trying to take that role on himself and has found a way into making a bunch of money through that. He's also, Santiago has moved the family into a house that like Joyce couldn't have imagined herself being in. She didn't particularly like the family that used to live there, but they've like leveled up by moving into this home. I mean, the coffee table that you mentioned, Ingrid, is, I mean, it's really an object that sort of tells us a lot about the characters throughout time, both because there are pictures as a display on the coffee table all the time, and they move, and she makes room for new pictures throughout time, but also because right, it's the one object that she carries out of her poverty, and that like she actually gets picked on a little bit, and part of her attachment to that is that when Santiago tries to take on a summer job, he wants to like replace this cracking coffee table for her if he can't pay to fix it first. And so I think that sudden ability to just replace everything and erase poverty and make it new is a big thing, right? But we also get some weird sort of transactional, notional things. Adam is both a character who's like, there's a real affection between Joyce and Adam. I think you're right to think that Santiago cares about Adam. But Adam's mother does kind of leave him as to erase her own debts. And then later when Joyce re-encounters Adam, it's this horrifying situation where she recognizes an older Adam. She wants Adam to notice her. He doesn't seem to notice her. She tries to give him $5, sees that the other children he's with are jealous of that $5, so she feels like she can give them $5, you know? And his new mother describes herself as having papers to prove that she got him fair and square. And I think that all of that is this really horrifying thing about, I think, this imagination that money itself will somehow fix problems. That's also about negotiating like what a real kind of family and a loving set of relationships looks like, especially because Joyce, because of the way Santiago is making his money, is she's alienating herself from her mother. She, like, at one point has an argument with her mother about seeing Santiago, and her mother only gets angrier about it and, like, gives her $100, and she feels infantilized by that money. She goes and buys a little snack and eats it. It's described as if, like, a child, sort of unabashedly. I think of that moment as being a little retaliatory against her mother, and she pays for this, like, kind of nonsense thing with a $100 bill. But also her friend is, you know, has married an older man. The way that Joyce thinks about that is her friend Pearl says that he's the man of her dreams, but that immediately goes to him owning several restaurants, but they also live out in the suburbs. And, right, like, he will take on Pearl's other children, but won't deal with Humphrey because of the drug stuff. Humphrey's not only using drugs, he's selling them. So it's not clear whether or not that's sort of like Joyce's mother, or if it's because the addict thing is a problem for him. But we also get, like, Ricky's insight. He's going around, he kind of complains, like, that it's a hell of a way to make money to be driving Santiago around. He's always on call. But he also, right, like, he knows it's weird. He brings up to Joyce at one point that, like, he goes to this house and there are these 12 or 13-year-olds who are just sort of, like, counting bills and, like, packaging them. And he describes it must be a sin to have that much money at one time. And he describes it as being more money than several generations of his family could ever make. And he doesn't remember the house. He doesn't fantasize about stealing it. I think it's just the awe of that. Smokey Peebles, the kind of head honcho of this drug organization, I think thinks about money also in a sort of nouveau riche, bizarre way, but he wants to talk about it a little bit. At one point, Ricky, we get that insight from him about money. Ricky is mortified by meeting Smokey Peebles. Joyce immediately was like, well, you should have introduced yourself. And can I call you Smokey, Mr. Peebles? And, right, like, Ricky, I think because he's around it more often, he's more engaged in it, he's a little more mortified by it. He's like, it flabbergasts him that there's a white guy who he thinks might only have the job of just making banana splits and milkshakes for people that Smokey Peebles wants him to make milkshakes for. He's also mortified by the fact that Smokey is clearly a pedophile and has like overdressed up a child to be his date. But what Smokey tells him in the story he recounts to Joyce is largely about how he wears Chuck Taylors, even though they're not very expensive at this point in the world, because when he was a kid, Chuck Taylors were popular, in contrast to all these other kids who are working for him who are really into like pump up Air Jordans. And that he thinks that like having those Chuck Taylors is somehow this symbol of making it, but also of getting to establish himself, because he felt mocked by other people when he was a kid and he was poor and he had to wear off-brand Chuck Taylors. And so there's a little bit of an infantile revenge with money there, but also it gives him, having all that money and all that power allows him to walk out of that ice cream parlor and just be like, stay in school, kids, don't do drugs, stay away from that mess, which is exactly how he's making his money, is addicting people to drugs. And so I think there's a disconnected morality there with Smokey, not nearly, I mean, it's clearly more violent and messed up than it is with Joyce, but that willful joy in the affluence without wanting to engage it in that one. And you see that Joyce is on the edge of facing that morality through these small moments where she's remembering that story. I think the story, anyway, even if Joyce is connecting that to Humphrey, she like helps him get his shoes off. He's got these $200 pair of shoes, but he's got holes in his socks, which might reflect something, both like presentation of affluence over real attendance to the self, but also something a little bit like that coffee table that is its own character in the story, which is the like, I came up from my roots, or like the Chuck Taylors that like, I'm still, in my head, it's like a Jenny from the Block thing. Like, I made it, but I'm still Jenny from the Block. That's a reference that I didn't know I had, but I'm going to shut up on that moment.
I love what you're saying about how I love the thinking you're doing around like the connection where these characters come from and the connection they do or don't have with with the money in particular and where it's coming from. Some of the stories you bring up about Ricky in particular, reading them and hearing you even describe them kind of give me the chills, because I think his attitude toward money makes a different kind of sense to me, like him being mystified at some of what Smokey Peebles is doing at the child prostitute who's being taken advantage of, or maybe not prostitute, but a child who's certainly being taken advantage of, as well as even that like white man who's working just that one bizarre job. There's something like that feels kind of not okay about it, and something that feels really right about Ricky seeing all that money and feeling like that's a story to tell, like the immense amount of something that's outside of an institution, and at once like the kind of beauty of stripping money of its power in that scene. There's a line around like the kids counting it like so many leaves, but how like valueless it becomes sort of horrific in that moment too. Something that you tell someone about to kind of get off your chest. And I mean, I think Jones is coming at money from all these different nuanced places, like even though there is this parallel drawn between Joyce and Pearl, her childhood friends. They both share what the story calls like poor woman's dreams of being rich. There are differences between them too and how they go about relating to money in their actions in their lives. And, you know, I mean, I think you've also drawn some really smart distinctions between money and the material objects within the story, which are very present too in that Chuck Taylor story, and, you know, in terms of the relationship Joyce has to the table, this older object. And Matthew, you did an amazing job tracking all of these characters, which brings me to my next question. I love Russian literature, and one thing that people always complain of with Russian literature is the names and how many characters they are and how hard they are to track. And, you know, it's so true that in writing a story, especially within large, maybe even rambunctious or unwieldy cast, that, you know, it can be a challenge to juggle all those characters as both a writer and a reader. So I guess thinking about that, like, did you have any trouble keeping track of characters in this story? And, you know, whether you did or whether you didn't, what do you think Jones does technically to help us not get lost in a cast so large? Like, is it a pacing thing? Is it a naming thing? Like, what is he doing technically to guide us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a sense of realism or something like to Russian literature where everybody's named Anna something or like what have you, right? And I don't know, some of that's never bothered me so much. Like, I think you can adapt in any space to how naming conventions work, and people get hung up on Russian literature because of the like patronymic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we just aren't as familiar with how nicknames work. Like, no
Sure.
one in America is that confused when like someone's named Ted and then you find out his name is Edward when he's at home. That just feels like a realism thing. I think that there's a couple different things though that Jones does, acknowledging that large casts are hard to keep your head around.
I feel like that's such a funny example. Ted to me is always Theodore, so
yeah,
I feel like Ed is better for that. But
yeah,
not to get getting caught up on the particular.
Yeah, I think it's that like you know, like we don't get like that hung up when those things are a little bit weird for us, you know? And I think that like, you know, here, I mean, Santiago is a name choice that like is so distinct from Ricky sonically. So like, even if you're like, they're moving around together a lot. And so where he's put characters together is like, you can figure out how somebody goes from somebody named Humphrey to being amongst his friends and colleagues the Hump, you know? Like, it's not that big of a mystery, but also Humphrey and Santiago are going to interact a lot, and that H and S sound are so very, very different. And I think he's made a conscious choice to keep those kinds of things similar, and he hasn't gone wild with nicknaming Joyce and Mama Joyce. Comprehensible. But he also goes to the trouble to sort of tell you how the name Mama Joyce is there, or to give Joyce herself that memory of breastfeeding the Hump, and like giving him that like that gift, and also it gives us an opportunity to better understand Pearl, to better understand the kind of relationship that Pearl and Joyce had, where in this case Pearl is concerned with making sure that her child gets like the right kind of nutrition and the right kind of like immunity in particular against disease, but she for some reason is incapable of producing breast milk, so Joyce as her friend takes that on, and as her roommate takes that on. So I think he does both things, right? There's a seamless interconnection between, right, like the names and how we learn about those names and the sort of unfolding of the story, but he also doesn't bring in the names of excess characters often, right? Like, if you got, like, there's a sort of functional thing about the guy who makes milkshakes. If he had a name tag on and Ricky had remembered his name, I'd have to be dealing with Bob, the guy who made milkshakes, and I would still probably just functionally go to the guy who made milkshakes. But because those stories are told to Joyce a lot, that really, it adds a seamlessness about that. But I mean, the really basic thing too is just that we're always in Joyce's head in that way, or we're very close to Joyce's head. And so we get her world, and her world excludes, we don't, I think I've lived in DC, and I think throughout this book, right, like Jones is so good at laying out this city in particular and how you move through it and the weirdness of different neighborhoods and how people think about them and the sort of striking like intersection of like how neighborhoods work and the oddity of encountering like those kind of blocked off spaces. I think it's really notable about the book that there really isn't an engagement with the massive industry of like Americana vacationers or like the politicos, but it's very much set in neighborhoods themselves and people's day-to-day lives. And I think, in that way he manages to do this thing where like you could pick up these little details if you go to DC. Like it's actually a very good map of the city. Like you're not that lost in it. But I think all of that it flows so seamlessly out of who the characters are and what their concerns are that like you're riding with Joyce and what's going on in her world. And, her worry, her mother doesn't come in right away, right? Like you get a little indication of that worry. Later on, she goes to see the mother and you have that encounter. So that kind of sectioning and that illusion back and forth works, but it feels very organic to how you would actually kind of perpetually kind of have it in the back of your mind while you're trying to enjoy your affluence and forget your troubles, that your mother now is really mad at you and your son. And how that would blow up as soon as you go to visit her. But I think Jones makes that really, he's so good at doing that, right? Like keeping us close so that we experience it with the character. So I had a really easy time following her, but I'm also really engaged with the text.
Yeah, same. There's no issue that I have with the characters. And, figuring out who they are. I agree that the names are pretty distinctive and none of them are really close to another name. That's one thing that's easy. Even when he introduces characters the first time without saying who they are or what their name is, it's pretty easy because later, like the same person, my example here is Adam. When we first meet Adam, he's not named.
Yeah.
He goes out to eat with the family because Santiago takes Adam's mother. I think her name's Tamara.
Yeah, I think he says it one time.
Yeah, I think he says it one time.
This woman who's doing things with her son or something.
Right. Anyway, he's kind of off mentioned that Tamara brings her son to this dinner with Santiago and the rest of Santiago's family. And that's the first time we meet him. Then, like, a little later in that scene, when they're outside and Ricky's car won't start, then Adam, who's not named, is just the boy, sits down and sighs, knowing that this is going to take a while because he's lived with his mother for, X number of years and he knows how these things go. Right. So that's when we meet him the first time. And then we meet him again when Tamara drops off Adam to stay with Joyce and to cover her debt and so forth. That's when we first get his name. Point being, even when characters aren't named specifically at the outset of a scene, they are pretty seamlessly interwoven later in the story. Another thing I really like is how when Ricky first is taken to meet Smokey, he thinks Smokey is the large man sitting across from the girl that Smokey is doing horrible things with, because this large man has been rumored, well, Smokey has been rumored to have killed 3 people. And so automatically, Ricky's thinking, well, it's this large man that killed all these people. Plus, the large man is wearing the nicest suit he's ever seen. Yeah. And something he would like to get buried in.
Yeah, I love that detail. It's so good.
And so he's just imagining that the large man is Smokey, and kind of is not paying as much attention to the fact that Santiago goes to the milkshake bar and sits next to someone who looks like a boy, who is actually Smokey Peoples. And the reason he does that is that he's reporting to Smokey Peoples. And he only realizes that Smokey when Smokey gets up and introduces himself to Ricky, in a very casual manner. So I think even when things aren't named specifically from the outset, they're like very easily interwoven, whether it's through the narration or through like a scene where Ricky's telling Joyce about his first encounter with Smokey.
I think that's well put, and I like it that you bring that up, Matthew, in terms of, I think it actually is something that Jones does in this story quite a bit and across the collection, where he won't name someone at first and then will bring them up, but in a way that I so agree it's never confusing, because, he does choose distinct names because he very much grounds these characters in particular stories and anecdotes in the way another character sees them. And, we often get them across a story. I think that's even true of characters who I'd classify as more like minor characters, like Clovis and Taylor, Joyce's 2 kids by other men. I know a little bit about each of them, and they're not just characters who he gives a name to and moves on. So I actually want to go back to money.
Okay.
Related to my earlier thought about money as one of the story's concerns, how does class get communicated in this story? I think it's also really, really important to the story. So even though it's, very much related to money, I think spending a moment with it is a good thing too.
Well, I think Adam covered a lot of this already, in certain respects, with the details that Jones gives us. For example, the socks that Humphrey's wearing. And, the bike that Santiago buys for Taylor, he goes out and, mangles it somehow, playing with it. And Joyce is upset that Taylor has done so. And Taylor's response is like, well, it's a toy. It's meant to be played with. And Joyce is like, not when it's $300. It's not. And, then Santiago's like, well, I'll just have Ricky go fix it next week, as if it's nothing. Because he's gotten to the point where it is nothing to him. So it's like he's already moved from being poor to, feeling comfortable in his richness. Whereas it's slowly happening for Joyce, and she's having trouble. She loves what she has, but her mindset hasn't necessarily changed completely. She keeps her house locked tight because it's dangerous outside and people might steal things, and They might come in and murder you, whatever, right? And we get more about that through, obviously, the table, which is a centerpiece for this, which I think we're going to talk about later, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it right now. But like even more telling, I think, is the fact that when Joyce goes to visit her mother's got this old black and white TV set that Joyce bought for her on credit, I believe. And it's a small set, and like this happened 12 years prior to that scene happening. And, you know, it's like this stark difference between what's in Joyce's house and what's in her mother's apartment. And her mother's still content to wear her husband's clothes and his aftershave and, you know, these things. She doesn't want like all of the material possessions that money can offer. But it's also telling, I think, that Santiago has been sleeping at his grandmother's on the floor next to her like he used to do when he was a child. Because though he acts like he's moved up in class, like his heart or his mind, something won't let him like let go of his family, you know, like and completely flaunt the fact that he's rich because he knows his grandmother hates it.
Yeah.
How he did it. And so he's still like, in a certain way, he's like torn between classes, and figuring out how to like make it work. The problem between Humphrey and Santiago is that Humphrey owes Santiago an undisclosed amount of money. He's either not paying him for the drugs that he's selling, or he's not paying him for the drugs that he's using and not selling, or some combination therein, right? And like the issue here is that Santiago knows he has to pay Smokey, and he also can't have a loose cannon, so to speak. That's always high. That's always not, you know, returning the money he owes to Santiago, which in turn is owed to Smokey, right? And so there's this interesting chain of class within, you know, the drug selling industry that also takes shape throughout the story.
Yeah, I think that's a really good articulation of the things at hand, right? Like that this is a story, as we keep discussing directly and indirectly, about moving up in the world and what that means for these folks. And then, right, like, you know, that, like, I keep thinking of that song, like, we started from the bottom, now we're here. We start from the bottom, now the whole gang's here. And, like, that want to bring everybody with you, or that feeling of obligation with your affluence, and part of your affluence being about being able to provide for other people. You know, my friend Jason Braun is always talking about what he calls the, like, poverty mindset, right? That, like, he feels as someone who grew up in a fairly poor community, that as he's become a more middle class person, that he's got to kind of constantly learn to be comfortable doing things that people who are middle class just do, right? Like, to, like, get a hotel near the place that he's going to visit, rather than, like, wake up 3 hours early to take a bus from a hotel that's, like, way on the outskirts of wherever he's going, because he can get that hotel room for $20 cheaper, or what have you. And I think that, like Matthew said, Santiago is so much more comfortable having money than so many of the other characters. And so the sort of complications of the sin of so much money, or the nervousness about money and finance doesn't bother him in the same way. I think one other thing I might want to add on this topic, like we were joking the other day about my grandmother who like grew up during the Depression and would buy like clothes from really cheap places right after a season ended and then keep them in little piles to give you to the nearest event like Christmas or your birthday, so that she'd buy cheap sweatshirts right after winter was over and then give them to me on my birthday in the summer so that I had a winter shirt. And she very much thought in those terms, and I think those things have after effects, and some of those after effects are they're like that kind of poverty mindset thing, and some of them are part of how we learn affection and how we learn to think in terms of affection, so that like wearing your dead husband's cologne can both be a pragmatic thing, right? Like when I was a kid, I was constantly getting dead relatives hand-me-downs from my grandmother. At the same time, right, that gift of having something of someone else's then becomes an emotional support in some way. Wearing your dead husband's cologne can be about keeping him alive in some sense, and I think that kind of rapid, I think if you're someone in that kind of transitional space, you're not necessarily thinking in those. You can still have attachments of that kind, wanting to sleep on your grandmother's floor. I think many people who are accustomed to being rich are very dissociated from the objects in their lives in that, like, well, I can get the bike fixed kind of way. And that thing that I wanted to add is really that, right, like, I think in some ways this is all so painful and so intense for us. Like, I think drug narratives become popular and gangster narratives become popular for this exact reason. It's that ability to level up, but they also have this kind of high, almost like Greek sense of like the possibility of betrayal within families and friendships, and that need to grasp at things in order to stay comfortable, or you have to bring this person along, or that kind of thing. Like I keep thinking of like Michael Lewis books, right? Like, or if you've seen The Big Short, which is based on a Michael Lewis book, that I think, like there's something about this that doesn't always feel as profound to us when we think about it in like, like you're reading NPR or something going like, oh, look, like inflation is rising, like, and you're like, wow, I'm making like, even the guy at the gas station is making $20 an hour or something, right? And you're maybe a little amazed by that, but you're not thinking about all the like capitalist sins and crimes and all this other kind of stuff that is in the background, because no one, if you're like middle class or comfortably like middle class, is sitting there like murdering someone over the possibility of $22 an hour and that rapid growth to move up. And I think one thing this story is really engaged in is asking about the consequences of that. And I think dealing with a drug market is so dramatic because the possibility of going from, right, like drugs, certain kinds of drugs in particular, right, like I think the opioid pandemic brought this home for people across classes, but I think often, right, like drugs are a way to forget that things aren't going well, that it's hard to keep a job and that kind of stuff. So highly addictive drugs like crack, like tend to like be shoved into poorer markets, right? Like we tend to socially forgive the fact that they're in poorer markets and then we go, oh, that's a dangerous neighborhood over there. I think the story is asking us to see how that market works, and it's inviting us to like look at that from the inside without glorifying the way in which that's happening, while still discussing the consequences of that. And then I think, right, like indirectly or in the background, asking us to reflect on a life in which you're sitting here reading a book and discussing like a literary piece of fiction and like not worrying about it and like thinking out all those ways in which, right, that like need to be better and not worry about whether or not you can have this, or like wanting to show this off, or wanting to be able to like give your friend a job or whatever, has all these other interpersonal consequences. And I think that's probably true regardless of class, as long as we're striving for class. But it's so much amplified here by the speed of what is driving that class change, that class shift.
I think what's really interesting about that is the point you made earlier too, is how when Smokey walks outside, all the kids are like, hey Smokey,
Yeah.
and his like bodyguards throw change.
Yeah.
And the change like is hitting
geez.
kids in the head and stuff, but they don't care because it's money.
Yeah.
And they're picking it up, and then they sing a song like tailored to Smokey because they know it's like his beneficence that has like given them the opportunity to go out and have some fun, and they're, you know, what they can't do normally. And the fact that Smokey's like, don't get caught up in this, I think is some of his awareness that like it gets you something, no doubt, and it might get you a lot of things, but there are also probably better things that you can be doing, and he realizes that, and I think he also realizes he can't go back and do that because of what he's done already. And so he's like hopeful that somehow, the kids will listen to him because he has this power over them. And yet.
Yeah. The difference between the Chuck Taylors and the off-brand Chuck Taylors is $7.
Yeah.
Probably doesn't require 3 people's lives, even if that's a true story about it.
Yeah, certainly. I'm so glad that we stayed with class a little bit here, because I think one of the things that so impresses me about how Jones treats these characters is, there are certain things on their minds, and it so much infuses almost everything they do, every little behavior, every little moment in the story. When I wrote this question out, I was thinking about this moment where Joyce is just sitting in her new house, and she sits across from Humphrey, and what follows is this line: in what the store salesman had called a Queen Anne chair. One of her legs was resting across a chair arm, an old habit she was trying to break in the new house. It's such a little moment, but we learn from it that she learns the name of this particular chair in the store, and that, she's trying to actually change how she sits on this new furniture. And like, there are so many moments like that throughout this that tell us something about where these people have come from and how they want to change or how they don't want to change, how they have regrets in Smokey's case.
What a choice to go to something that like infers that whole like that royalty thing, right?
Right.
That we can't, however much we fetishize democracy, shake from ourselves.
Truly. So we've been dancing around the coffee table and also Joyce's house, which I think is really central to this story. Let's talk a little bit about how both the coffee table and Joyce's house move along and give shape to this story. In reading this collection, some of what I loved about this particular story, and part of why I chose it for StoryTalk, was the coffee table. My personal favorite.
Shocking.
My personal favorite story in the collection is the store, and it's very long, and I had to think very hard about which one to choose, but I had to go with this one because of the coffee table. I love how Jones uses it and the house as, almost like in baking, as binding agents. And I think that's similar to, I think this story is similar to others in the collection in its treatment of time in particular. And in Jones's refusal to sort of section off backstory or stick too closely to a day in the life type model or a and then type structure, I think of Jones's relationship to time as being much more fluid, but also much more rigid. He's extremely attentive to time and also to place. As Adam mentioned, he's constantly mapping this city that we're supposedly lost in. And he's similar about time. As fluid as his structure is, he's kind of always going back to it. Two examples that I pulled from the same page, actually, are these. The photograph had been taken a year or so before she met Ricky, and a month after her tubes were tied. So, I mean, that precision, and he's always doing that, kind of listing off a particular time and using that to relay another bit of information. Here's another example. 3 weeks after she'd promised to come by the next day, Joyce finally got up the courage to visit her mother. A line that I love. In what other ways does Jones bring past details into the present? And why do this in this story in particular? What effect does it have on the story as a whole? So I'm giving you a lot to do here. We're talking about the coffee table, we're talking about Joyce's house, and we're also talking about these past details, bringing them into the present, and how that sort of alters the story's whole.
Yeah, I'm gonna very quickly demarcate, the oddity of time and space by saying on page 164 of my copy, the grandfather clock in the hall downstairs struck 10, and Joyce lifted her head momentarily from Ricky's chest to listen for Clovis getting up and going to the bathroom. I think that what's really interesting and what's one of Jones's innumerable gifts as a writer is that, right, he manages to often introduce, I think he's unabashed about marking time in those ways, the kind of, 3 weeks after, etc., or introducing the grandfather clock, but knowing when and how to do it such that it becomes part of what is telling in the story, right? The grandfather clock is present. It's this odd sort of, I remember my own grandfather, he always wanted a grandfather clock. He thought that was the classiest thing, And so went out and bought a kind of IKEA style, put it together yourself grandfather clock from Walmart late in his life. And it was gaudy and it was hideous and it was loud and it didn't fit in the room. But also, right, this particular grandfather clock either wakes up Clovis regularly or she knows her son in some way intimately in his habits. We know that he's already in bed by 10. While Ricky might be, in other places, she's thinking about time in terms of Ricky being home late or not in time for the dinner that she makes to have a kind of family-style meal. There's something reliable about the son, right? We don't actually get him getting up, right? We don't get Clovis getting up. We don't actually hear that. She just listens for it, that kind of comforting thing. I think all of those sort of inferences end up being there in that short moment, that short use of time. But then we dive from that right to, at the last, this little boy, Sandy, had been talking to turned in his seat and hopped away from the stool. He twisted his body. So we're moving right back into this other narrative going on, where Ricky's telling about Smokey Peebles, right? I think he does that so seamlessly, but it also feels like something that's happening as we go, right? If you think about Edward P. Jones in terms of film, I think for a lot of reasons, his rich details, the choice to go with Peebles as a last name here, who's a fairly, Smokey Peebles isn't, but Mario Peebles is a very famous filmmaker. But also, I think there's something about that, like, if this were filmed, the camera's changing in an ongoing, longer conversation going on that helps that kind of smooth flow. And I think he does that really well, but I think he's also in that process capturing something more like reality. You never actually stare someone straight in the eyes and listen to them tell a long story. Or most of us don't. It would be a little creepy in some way. And I think he does that. But I think also most of us experience our lives in this kind of ongoing way, and we remember things back, right? Like, you tell me a story and that reminds me of something that relates to that, and I go back. And so it feels, I think he's very good at structuring real life in that way, so that it feels like real life. But by using those demarcations, we get something more like a controlled narrative flow.
Yeah, I think with the table, Joyce is constantly rearranging things because in her mind, like, she's updating it to include how she thinks about her life now. And Jones talks about, like, how certain people have, like, heads, arms cut off because other pictures are overlaying it. And that simply has to do with, like, where she's at now. She's not with Levitt or Woody, two of her older beaux. She's with Ricky now. So, like, the pictures change over time. And, like, Jones marks, like, at 10 is when pictures of Ricky start happening with her family. And she even makes a point I think it was at a Christmas, to make Ricky sit down with the three kids around him, Joyce's three kids around him, and take a photograph to, like, update, like, where she's at. Like, so in certain ways, that's, like, her trajectory and, like, how she thinks about herself. And, like, these are the things that are important now, and we can overlay some of these photos with some of the updated photos. Like, that's still part of her life. It's just, like, occluded a bit by things that have happened more recently.
Including the moving lacuna, right? Like, the future tense is always there.
Right. And then I think another way Jones does this is just brilliant. And it comes in like seamlessly throwaway lines where Ricky and Joyce have been living in this house for like a year or 2 years. And Ricky comes home and tells the Smokey Peebles story. And they're up in their bedroom drinking beer, smoking cigarettes. And he's telling her this story. And at one point, Ricky went downstairs to get more beer because the tiny refrigerator in their bedroom had conked out the day before. Like, it's seemingly a throwaway line, like, all right, he's going to go get a cold beer. But what it's actually saying is, like, even new shit breaks.
Yeah.
You know? And you're like, whoa, man. Like, and the first time you read it, you kind of are like, yeah, okay, makes sense. Moving along. And then you're like, wait a minute. Didn't they just move into a new house? And you're like, yeah, they did. But, like, you know, even new things aren't necessarily better things. They're just new things. Someone else maybe hasn't used them. Someone else produced them recently. But, like, how good are they actually? And I think the other thing that really kind of sticks to me is the way in which we find out how Joyce is lying to Ricky. And that is in the fact that she initially tells Ricky early on in their relationship, or at least earlier than they moved in together, I think, that she can give him as many kids as he can handle. And he's like, I can handle 100, you know, or like, I can pay for 100, or like something like that.
Yeah.
Because Ricky's talking about, like, the love he would give his own children. And Joyce has to continue going with that throughout their life together because she said that initially. Meaning she has to continue that lie in order for her to believe that Ricky won't just leave. Because at one point, there's a line about how she might wake up one day and Ricky will just be gone. Which is generally, I think, what happened with Levitt and Woody. Right? Like you wake up one morning and everything's changed because this person left, or something like that. The other thing that does is to show us that Joyce and Santiago's promises aren't worth anything. Because Joyce, at one point, has Santiago sit down with Humphrey and work things out like they did when they were kids. You have to stay in the room and work it out between yourselves, and you can't come out before you have patched things up. Well, this time, it appears like they're working things out, and then, a few days, weeks later, Santiago kills Humphrey. And Santiago learned this idea of lying from Joyce. And it's very clearly throughout this story. I'm not going to go into like all the ways that it happens, but he is very much like his mother in a lot of ways that the story, picks out. And it's this learning how to lie and feel all right with yourself that drives all of the action in the story from those two characters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that those are really smart examples of, ways in which, in small ways, something from the past comes in. Even something like, we're going to have this sit down in the same room now. And you're going to work it out like you did when you were kids. It tells us that this is a patterned thing. We've talked about the coffee table some. In terms of its structure, I think it's important to say that like Jones, comes to it in this way that's very fluid, but almost there's like a braided essay type quality to it, where like the coffee table like sometimes gets its own scenes, where Joyce goes to thinking about the coffee table and what it looks like, and area parts where it's damaged and what particular photos are under it now and what they've meant. So I mean, it's really like woven into the story's structure in that way, and is almost given the like love and care of an actual character, and it does have these characters beneath its glass, and likewise the house. While it's new, like has that same history. We learn about, Joyce's relationship to it over time. How, if you'd told her that she'd someday be living there, she wouldn't have believed it. The family that lived there before her, the ways in which she's always locking its doors as if the house, can protect her in the way that almost a person or behaviors could, and there also are details around the house, mold being a thing in the house, that as much as Santiago's like throwing money at trying to kill living things in the house, that there is kind of this fuzz that's forming on the walls in the basement, and that's among mouse traps, crucially too. So, we get a sense of the fact that this house is new, but has these kind of a living quality to it, as well as living things coming into it.
Yeah. Well, you can't pay to make nature go away.
Indeed.
And yeah.
Not forever.
No. There's a lot of interesting things about that, but I'm not going to get distracted by it. You look like you have another question, Ingrid.
Yeah, I do. There's so much to cover. I'm so glad that we went into like Santiago's learned behavior from Joyce, and her particular way of treating Ricky, and what the consequences that has for her long term and for him. Of course, we'll go into that some more. But perhaps because of the way Ricky relates to money, because of the way in which Joyce is manipulating him unfairly. I find myself especially drawn to his character as a reader, and I think another thing about that is that I feel at once surprised and unsurprised at how he reacts to Santiago in particular, and I I love it about characterization and moments in stories where I feel that surprise on surprise, where I believe it, that it could happen, and that it is happening this way, and that it makes sense. But I have some sort of preconception in my head about how someone's going to act or how something's going to go, and I get this subverted expectation that's really delightful. So I'm wondering if you two felt surprised at how Ricky responds to Santiago too, and if you could speak a little to the friction between Ricky and Santiago and the sort of consistencies and inconsistencies that make Ricky feel so well developed
Yeah,
as a character.
I think because Joyce isn't engaged in Santiago's day-to-day activities, a lot of what we learn about the activities from the outside, the drug dealing, etc. Like we actually cover, to Matthew's point, a slightly larger swath of time and odd densities of time, right? Like I think the story feels sort of seamless, almost like it happens in the course of a week, or it actually takes a little bit longer. And so I think that close attention to timing that you mentioned ends up being important to thinking out just how quickly the new fridge breaks, but also like how some of the stuff with Humphrey and Ricky play out. And I think that one thing we haven't talked so much about that I think so, and I got like a little weepy listening to Matthew, like thinking out some of the relationships and the way they're articulated through like the photographs, is that, I mean, there are the class elements here, there's the movement up, but of course all of that there's the personal safety thing, the danger outside that comes up time and time again. But there's also this need to build connections and be with other people and to care for them and to have a sense of like family, which isn't inherently blood. Like this horrifying thing that we learn about Joyce, that because Ricky is the first man she's with who doesn't beat her, she thinks that he's not serious about her. And I fuck, man, like that is so heartbreaking. And I think she can't.
And actually, like, such a common thought when it comes to abuse. People think that, like, jealousy, for instance, is a kind of protective impulse that is about care. And, sometimes it is what's complicated, but that as someone abused, you get in that framework of thinking that you're not cared for if you're not treated that way is so sad.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, we kind of get this unfolding of Ricky, and I think it's tough to walk into, I mean, even like without children, to like walk into someone else's life and like to become part of their existing world. And, like they, Jones / Joyce describes the relationship as a common law marriage. So it develops over time, right? And I think it's always to figure out that relationship between like, okay, this is the person who like biologically is the father of this person, but they just don't exist anymore, is so tough. But I think our cultural ideas, which is also like related to a class idea around who can raise a child and should raise a child, it's sort of an unspoken thing that in part, right, like suddenly Ricky's making money because his stepson is dealing drugs and has given him a job. And, right, like, so now's the time to have 100 kids, right? Like, then like that he wants his own kid. He says it's discouraging that he can't, and she wants to give that to him, but she'd rather give him the idea than tell him the truth, because, or even ask herself the question of, can't, she does in her own head ask herself if she can untie the tubes. I think I'm saying all of that because we get Ricky through his stories, and we've talked about, Ricky's concern with the, like, Smokey People's child girlfriend. We've, we've talked a little bit about his sort of like awe and like nervousness around like the sheer amount of money. But I think also because like a lot of what we learn about him is through these moments where like I think he describes himself as a family man without a family, and in some ways I think we learn through his stories, through what he's trying to do, that he is trying to create and take care of a family, and Santiago is aging into the ability to help him, but is also naively maybe diving into this other thing. And I think Ricky's in this odd position, right? Like, where he seems to care about Humphrey, but is a little aloof about the difficulty of interacting with that, where like we never actually see him interact with Pearl or Pearl's guy. But he is trying to like build this life with Joyce, and I think that's part of it, is that feels real to me, like that tension of wanting. I think he's just a good dude, right? Like, it's an oversimplification, but I think he really does just want to build a family here, and he's trying to do that. And so we're learning about him through all the ways in which Santiago's job and how that's helping him elevate toward having a family with Joyce and all that is, like him just trying to do the damn thing. And then there are all these weird betrayals of what that is that, I feel like so sad about it.
It's a sad story.
I don't know. You probably have a better way of describing Ricky than I do, Matthew.
I don't know. But I guess what I will say is that, like you, Adam, I think he is just a good person, and he just likes Joyce, and probably loves her. And like at first, he's seeing her and he likes her, and then he eventually kind of takes on the responsibility of being the family man. And he continues to work hard at construction. And, at one point we learn that no matter how little money Ricky has, he's always able to take the family out to eat once a week, which is where we get the scene when Santiago gives him all that money to buy a cab, take the family home, buy a cab, go to work. And I think what happens in that scene is Ricky realizes that the power has shifted from him being the breadwinner to Santiago being the breadwinner. And so at first he's mad that Santiago's laughing at him. Then he's like, what are you playing the numbers, boy? And, Santiago's like, God provides. God provides. He doesn't say where the money's coming from. And the God provides, we'll learn later, is something he learned from Grandma. And in a particularly chilling twist, Grandma tells Joyce that, Grandma threatens Joyce to tell Santiago he's not welcome in her house anymore, while he's continuing to sell drugs. And if he shows up, she's going to call the police and have him arrested. And, Joyce is like aghast at this and, saying like, why would you do this? And Grandma's response is, God never gives us too much that we can't handle. Right? So that's coming straight from Grandma. And, Santiago has just found a different way to make the things happen that he wants to happen. Anyway, back to the power shift. It's that Ricky realizes Santiago has figured something out, and he wishes he would have been the one to figure that out. but he's not. And he hasn't figured that out because he's not that kind of person. But at this point, he's already become the family man, and he's roped into this, and he's involved, and he enjoys it so much that he's not willing to walk away, regardless of where Santiago's getting the money from. Eventually, even as we've pointed out, Santiago gives him the job as the driver, and more than anything, I think Ricky's just floored. He can't imagine how this has happened, how they have so much money, how he's living in this nice house. He can come home and drink beer every night and like hang out, but he has to go out like late at night, and by night I mean like he has to come home at like 4 a.m. like he can drink beer and unwind, but he's got to work from like whenever in the afternoon through the early morning hours, and that's how he pays the rent. And so like he realizes that it is taking him away from like the thing he really wants, which is to be with Joyce and to be with Joyce's kids and the family. And, you know, but, you know, he's so caught up in having a family of his own, meaning like at least one child with Joyce, that like that's his anxiety here. He's got the money, as Adam has said, like, and he's ready to do the thing. And he even accuses Joyce at one point of being on the pill, and Joyce is like, "No, I'm not on the pill. It just takes time to make a baby." Right? So she continues to like string him along. He's also getting strung along by Santiago, though, in that like he's when Santiago says jump, he's got to jump. And we see that like right in the opening of the story, where they're talking about the table, and Santiago's like threatening to break the table just so he can force his mother to go buy a new one and bring it in, because he thinks it's an eyesore in front of all of the expensive new furniture that they've purchased for her. And, you know, Ricky says, "He's right, honey," Ricky said. "He had been her common law husband for 6 years. Better find something new. We can look next week." Santiago stopped laughing and turned to Ricky. "My mother's old enough to know what she want. She ain't nobody's child, Ricky. She don't need nobody telling her what to do." And Ricky says, "I didn't mean anything by it, Sandy. Why are you getting all upset again? Besides, I think I should be able to tell my own woman something." "Ricky, you can't tell nobody shit. Just do what I tell you and keep your mouth shut." Right? And so like we see that Ricky's at the mercy of Santiago. He's at the mercy of Joyce. And things aren't going anywhere as far as that goes. But his hope continues to be that child that he's wants to have with Joyce. Or more than one child, lots of children. And that's why at the end of the story, when Ricky sees Santiago shoot Humphrey, he runs. Because that's the final straw. And he can't do it anymore, right? Like he had so much hope, and he kind of lost sight of the dangerous world that he's become a part of because of his love for Joyce and her kids. But when, you know, murder comes in, and he realizes what a predicament he's in by working for Santiago and being, you know, an accomplice in this murder, he's got to go.
Matthew, I'm so glad that you brought up that opening scene. That's how we sort of get to the coffee table and get introduced to this story, in particular with that friction between Ricky and Santiago. Santiago pressuring his mother to get rid of the coffee table, and then that like quick reversal, him sort of snapping at Ricky, and Ricky responding like kind of playfully back almost. But with, you know, it's tinged with anger, and Joyce quickly diffuses that scene. I think what stuns me as a reader is coming to that later scene, the one that you also mentioned, where, you know, Ricky's car is broken down and Santiago has money, and he offers that. And I mean, with him laughing at Ricky, with that moment, I expect Ricky, given, I think knowing that they say about Ricky that like one of his nightmares would be showing up late to work, which It's such a small, plain line, but tells me so much about him. I think I expect Ricky to like kind of perseverate on that and maybe like not accept that money and that change so quickly. And I think you're getting at something really important about Ricky, and I think what gives him like a lot of charge as a character. I think he at once experiences a sort of like wonder at what's happened, at seeing more money than he's ever seen in his life in one place, and at Santiago's solution, and he's willing to kind of accept that. And I mean, the thing that blows my mind at the end of this scene is that he loves the cab ride back so much. Like, that I didn't expect, but I think the story earns it consistently with its treatment of Ricky. But I think you're so right that he's also perceptive enough to be aware of the dark side of that money and where it's coming from, and the problems with the way he's being treated by basically everyone. And I don't feel surprised when he runs at the end either. I think there's a lot that's been building up to that moment. Let's turn back to Joyce, Mama Joyce. I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about her complicated relationship to motherhood, and some of this thinking that the story does around what it is to be a mother and have a mother, to raise and take care of children who are your own and who aren't your own. Let's talk a little bit here about Adam, the boy who's left in Joyce's care for 3 weeks, and also about Humphrey, who we haven't talked much about, and who's also this wonderful character who, deserves some of our attention here.
Yeah, I think that, right, so as Matthew mentioned earlier, right, we get introduced to Adam's mother when, right, like, I think that, how young Santiago is and how young all of these people are is articulated fairly early, but Adam's mother is a little bit older than Santiago, I think like 10 years, which is pretty dramatic when you consider that, like, I'm not sure at the very beginning of the story, Santiago is, he's maybe 20 at the oldest. And so, I mean, there's a pretty big gap between them in that regard. So he's taken the family out to dinner, which is part of that displacement of Ricky's sort of like man of the house situation. And Joyce is a little upset by this idea, right? She's still not quite accustomed to the notion of anyone doing things with her son, as she puts it, alone, this older woman with a child. And, right, like, as Matthew also noted, Tamara, I think her name is, eventually bails. We don't, presumably the money she owes Santiago has to do with drugs. But she bails, and there's this kind of tragic fight between Adam and his mother about it, and he throws this little car at her. And like, initially, Joyce just kind of wants this kid gone, the issue dealt with, and Santiago is a little dismissive. I think he describes it as the dopey bitch made a mistake, that won't, the kid is going to be gone, and then he's just there for a while, and Joyce becomes attached to him. I think there is this kind of like weirdness around blood relations that feels real. I don't think it's unusual to the story, right? Where Taylor and Clovis, they're not mentioned as much. They don't have this sort of profound impact, but there's never this kind of questioning around it. Nor does the story ever make distinctions like they're about like half brotherhood or anything of that kind at one point, right? Like,
that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that as a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, Joyce thinks about her children having different fathers, but she doesn't really think how, like, the distinctions of relations in that way. They're all her children. They're all children, although Adam at one point does say she used to be my mama. And he's articulating something about, right, that like being a child in transition or being a child who's been left out in that way, that I think is really both tricky and painful. And in some ways, we don't get that much of Adam. We get so much more of the story of how Adam ends up in her care. But Adam leaves this impact in that way that I think this significant thing that is people being in our lives can be, you know, like, I mean, that you spend more time or you spend time with someone in this like loving and caring way, and you become attached to them, and sometimes, right, like that can be more true than the people that you spend intimate time with as a child or when you're younger, and somehow, you know, for whatever reason, we've put this like need for blood relations to be significantly more important. We learn a little bit about what that time looked like in terms of how Joyce watched Adam change and get comfortable into the situation and finally start kind of like interacting and hanging out with her as he moves through his own grief. And we get these sort of wonderful details about like him playing with that car that he'd thrown at his mother, but not making noises like other boys did when he played with the car. But some of the details, maybe more of the specific details of what we learn, are she remembers making him banana splits, which she tells him and trying to get him to remember, or making him bubble baths. You know, I think that stuff, a lot of it feels a little unspoken, and sort of what her relationship is to that longing isn't quite explored, but she knows that she had a moment with this child, and this child had a moment with her, and she really needs that to be true, but she doesn't know how to extend it or make it real as time moves forward. And she doesn't, because this other woman has the papers on him, doesn't know how to actualize that. And I think that the kind of question of that hole and what it is feels so profound, specifically because it's going to relate back to Humphrey, right? Like her best friend, who she shared this kind of like mutual like maternity with, right? Like raising their kids together, sorting things out, sort of raising Humphrey and Santiago in a like fraternal way, like making them work things out, you know, how the two of them used to do it in the past, all of that, you know, it is building a family together, right? And I think Adam is so important to the story because he's going to open up that question for us in a way that flings back on Joyce. And I think we're more accustomed to narratives about fatherhood and like absentee fathers, or like fathers who leave or are capable of leaving in different ways. And I think that story, you know, it's kind of function apart from like helping us see who Joyce is and how caring she can be, also is giving us an opportunity to sort of reflect on what she's losing in that kind of absence of family connection that she has, right? Pearl's moved out into Potomac somewhere with this other guy, and Ricky alludes later that she doesn't come into the real world anymore, right? Right, like Joyce feels like she's, I guess, maybe in the real world, right? She's still got to lock herself away from it somehow, but she can't hold that family in, which is once we see Humphrey die, and that, you know, we don't really know what happens eventually with Ricky, but that we know there's a pretty real breaking point, that kind of weird Cain and Abel thing that happens between Humphrey and Santiago. I think all of that. I don't want to treat Adam as a like functionary in the story in that way, but I think that story is so significant because it's going to throw all those questions open for the reader, or it does for me as a reader. And yeah, I think I don't know. It's also just feels so real and painful. It's like so much of this story.
Yeah, and I mean, with so many of the stories, the timing of it and where it happens and how it happens is crucial. She runs into Adam on the way to her own mother's house, and has this encounter where she's trying to prompt his memory and get him to remember her, and he has a foster mother who's now taking care of him, who's worried about this woman coming up and about her own ownership of this child. And Joyce tries to give Adam and the other kids with him some money as, a kind gesture. And the woman doesn't want that, is worried about that muddying her own relationship and with the children, and worried about this strange woman coming up. But then, right out of that, she goes to her mother's house and has her mother worried about that $100 that Santiago had left there. And, Joyce is such a funny character in that she does have this real maternal warmth about her. Her house is a house that you can go to, whether you're Humphrey or Santiago or you're Ricky. Whereas her own mother's is not, but her own mother is looking at the reality of things in a way that Joyce isn't always, and I think that's some of what the story's thinking out around her. But tell us a little bit about Hump, Matthew.
Well, I'll get to Hump. We're going to finish with Adam, though, first, I think.
Yeah, please.
And that is to say that when Tamara leaves Adam at Joyce's house, we're told that no one ever sees her again, which to me means one of two things. She skips town, or Santiago kills her.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that lingers throughout, especially after you see him kill Humphrey. The next thing I want to say is that Adam has learned, because his real mother left him. Joyce didn't necessarily leave him of her own accord, but the state came and picked him up. So he's already lost at least two mothers, maybe more. We don't know.
Yeah.
And the reason he doesn't, act like he knows Joyce is that he's realized that to deny everything means you can't get hurt. If you don't care about anything, nothing can hurt you. That's why he sits in his corner and plays with the car and doesn't make any noise. Because he knows, the best thing to do right now is to be unnoticeable. And, I think it's very giving of him to actually, be like, nah, she was my mama at one point. And yes, it's for the money, but, also, I think he realizes it's good for them. His foster brothers and sisters, to have $15 in total. Maybe they can all get a banana split. But he also realizes Joyce is coming from a good place in her heart to be oh yeah, I used to take care of you for 3 weeks. And I think he recognizes that of all of his mothers, maybe Joyce was the best one he ever had. And it was only 3 weeks. To move to Humphrey, I think, Humphrey, I don't know science enough to tell you what not receiving your biological mother's milk does to you. I have no idea. Yeah. But the way the story's written, there's no way, regardless of whether he gets Joyce's milk or the box milk, that he's going to be immune to whatever's coming for him. It's like a myth or a prophecy of what's going to happen to Humphrey. And that is that he's not immune to addiction. And I actually think Humphrey is generally probably a pretty nice person. He's just addicted to crack. And you can see that in the way that he comes and tries to make peace with Mama Joyce and sleep in her house. He tries to pay part of the money to Joyce because he knows if he goes to see Santiago, things aren't going to go well. And, he even does this when he's really high. He knows it's the right thing to do. And, of course, it doesn't get him anywhere because he wakes up and he's not high, and he needs to get high, and he needs money to get high. And, regardless of if he sells all the sacks that he's carrying on him, he's not going to have enough money to sustain the high he needs to feel like whatever hole is in him has been satisfied. And so, the whole thing with Humphrey is that, he's just susceptible to certain things, and he's not welcome anywhere. He's welcome in Joyce's house for like momentary time frames when Santiago is nowhere near Joyce's house, which is why he waits for Santiago to leave to come to Joyce's house. But he can't say no to Joyce, and the way he comes to be shot is that like Joyce forces him to come over and have to sit down with Santiago. And Santiago then has to play a role. And, right, what happens, happens. So, I think Humphrey's caught in a situation where his upbringing has him too close to the thing that he wants and needs because he's tried it once. And he never can get away from that because he owes too much money and he needs too much crack.
Yeah.
And so circumstantially, because all of that is available to him fairly easily, and he's been given multiple chances up to this point, like, he's like, what is he going to do? It's not like he wants to go check into a rehab facility or even knows that there are rehab facilities. He doesn't have anywhere to go. He doesn't have anything that he can do.
We mainly get him through Joyce, so we don't have insight into whether he's thinking about rehab or what he does and doesn't know about rehab. But I think one thing that's telling is, Matthew, you're right that like he does try to like give the money in a moment and to kind of keep himself from spending that money, and he also. Even high, sometimes babbles in ways that are a little telling about trying to get shape, and waking up as if he were fighting with himself and thinking about his pride, that he still has some pride.
And the people don't know about it, which I think is significant, right? Like, both Humphrey and Adam are alienated because specifically blood relations don't reach out to take care of them, right? Like, Pearl kind of advocates for her son by calling Joyce to advocate through her son, but Pearl's new husband isn't dealing with Humphrey, and Pearl isn't personally turning up to like, which isn't to say that like addiction is hard. I'm not trying to judge Pearl or Pearl's husband. I'm saying that like one tricky thing here is the rules of protection and the sort of, there are people in Humphrey's life in particular, we don't really know about Adam's per Matthew's note. Like, we don't know if his mother is alive anymore. But Humphrey clearly has people who could help him reach out to resources, but he's found himself in a position where the disease he has and the dependency he's facing aren't going to find support. They're only going to find judgment and demand and the need to accommodate this, right? Like, the kind of logical question that you can like ask from years later and miles away is something like, why doesn't Santiago pay Smokey whatever it is that's owed and drive his like childhood like pseudo cousin to the like rehab facility himself and pay for it, or whatever as an alternative, and that isn't here, and somehow it becomes more plausible because they're not actually brothers or not actually cousins. There's only this like image of like having breastfed from Joyce or having grown up together. That tie isn't strong enough for some reason, and so all the rules of pure profit end up taking over instead. And I think that's so tough and complicated and cruel. I don't know.
Well, I think there's a little bit there maybe in jealousy, in that how Santiago's like super close to his mother, and the fact that Humphrey literally lived off of his mother. Like some of that's there. The story, as you say, it doesn't go into it.
Yeah.
But if there's anything, it's, as you said, like the Cain and Abel deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. This story is such a long one, and I think speaking of like things that are there, one thing I do sometimes when I'm trying to look at a story technically and learn something about it, that I can apply to my own practice or talk about here, is I try to pay attention to like what's in the story and why it's in the story, especially with longer stories. In this one, there's a story within this story that we've already talked about a little bit. Ricky tells Joyce about William Smoky Peebles and his day. He's just talking about his day. I'm curious, why add that story other than the kind of obvious, like, he's come home, they have to say something to each other. Like, why that story in this fictional work?
Man,
I've stumped them.
Yeah, I think there's like so many reasons and no reason.
Yeah.
But I think like is the right answer, like, but I think there's so many reasons because it's an opportunity. It's one of the few opportunities we get to sort of see process in Ricky's day, what it might look like.
Uh-huh.
And some of that is through what's unusual about the day. It's one of the few times where the aspect of race comes into the story. It's, and I think above all though, it's also like, it deals with the class stuff and all that, but I think above all of that is the fact that like, it's the view from the top kind of thing, right? Like that when your life is contained within all these things, right? Like you go to your job, it doesn't have to be driving like a drug dealer around to know that you like spend so much of your life just doing work and like trying to get by without necessarily thinking about what's important. And I think it's one of the fixations with like the crimes and like the bad behavior of rich people that many of us have, that like when you look at this thing from the top down and ask yourself, what's the point? Like, why is anyone doing, like, Humphrey isn't happier as an addict. Like, maybe when he's high, we never see that. We see him, like, in down moments, just trying to keep it together. We see the consequences of the drugs. We don't, see anyone having a moment of grace on crack. Right? It's possible that they exist. It's just not happening in this story. And I think that when we see Smoky Peebles, like, it's just this infantile shit, right? Like, that his own narrative for himself, the thing he wants you to know about him is that he's better than the, like, affluence, right? Like, he's better than buying a bunch of shit and showing off. He's not the guy with the nicest suit in the place, right? It's just me and Chuck. is what he
Which
said.
is literally the line.
Yeah, and is what he says about, like, he's gotten everything he could have, and the thing that he wants is a 9-year-old girl in makeup and shoes that were popular 15 years earlier. And I think that that's the horror of it, is there's no point here, right? Like, the things that he wants are horrifying. And all they do is perhaps, like, inure him against the kind of violence that Humphrey's going to get executed on him, and that Joyce keeps locking her door against. And it comes at everybody else's cost. And I think it's like, it's that reality, is that the top of having everything is not really having anything. And Joyce has a chance to know that through Ricky telling that story. And she fucking misses it so hard, you know? Like, it's part of why it's part of why it all hurts so bad. It's because she has an opportunity to see outside of it. She has an opportunity to go visit Pearl, and she never does. It's just, we get that story to tell us that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I'm going to add to that is that money's fucking stupid. You know, honestly, though, like, the only reason, maybe not the only reason, but, like, the main reason Smokey does what he does is that no one can stomp on his feelings anymore.
Yeah.
And that's what happened to him when he was a kid and couldn't afford Chuck Taylors. So, what are you going to do? You're going to make all the money, get all the power, and say, fuck you to everyone that stomped on his feelings. And, like, that's why money is bad. Like, it's plain and simple. It's like, you know, all these people are doing things they don't really want to do to get things they really don't want to have. If they were given from the get-go the opportunity to do whatever they wanted to do and just did something they liked.
Yeah.
Yeah, that scene is all those things. It's you know, shows us the structure of, you know, the sort of organization, if you'd call it that, you know, Santiago's working within, as well as Ricky, and, you know, gives us a glimpse at, like, Ricky's insight, and gives us Joyce's missed opportunity. I think, if either of you read that essay of David Foster Wallace's on Lynch?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was reminded so much of that essay, and I've read it years and years ago. Reading this scene in particular, I think of it as the most Lynchian scene in this story, in David Foster Wallace's sense of what Lynchian is, just in that there are these moments where there's something almost beautiful and strange, but also so horrifying and so poignant about the absurdity that it reaches. And I think even the particulars of the scene, Peoples' insistence on the Chuck Taylors, him slurping up the milkshake. It's in many ways the story's weirdest scene, but I think it really does add so much.
I think it's Lynchian in that it's so, like, when we get the bad guy is grotesque, he's ridiculous, he's not the bad guy we expect, he's awful in extreme ways, and the thing that you really want. You know, I said that Joyce missed the boat, but also it's Ricky's opportunity to run away, and I think that Lynch invites those opportunities of his characters for people to just...
Yeah, it pulls back the curtain on polite society.
Yeah.
That's what Lynch does.
Yeah.
Like, you know, we can all pretend that, like, we're all business people and, like, you know, we're all, like, getting along and so on and all this business. Well, yeah, you go into any house, any apartment, anywhere where you live, and you're going to find people that do these things because that's the only outlet they have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So this story is so long. We've talked for so long, but you know, I mean, I think looked at so many different strange moments within this story. let's move to the ending. I'm so affected by this story and its ending. I think because maybe because I'm kind of like theorizing here. Jones manages to strip a final scene that I think could easily fall into the trap of reaching too much for movement, or feeling a little sentimental or over tragic or something like that. Strip it to its barest bones and to at once conclude the story and help us as readers understand what will and won't be going forward without telling us too much and sort of shutting down possibility. I know what's happened, some of why and how it's happened, but I still wonder about these characters' fates, what's been, what's to come. I can't leave the story even though it's ended. It follows me around, and I feel a lot like Mama Joyce in her house. We didn't talk that much about this, but she spends a lot of time wandering around at night, kind of touching the objects in her house and thinking about Adam sometimes and Santiago when people will be home. But I feel that way at the end of this story. I feel kind of haunted by it. And by its objects. Like, I'm trying to fit another photo under my own glass table to understand it, which is me rambling about how I relate to this story. But could the two of you describe what happens in the story's final scene, how it happens, and whether or not the story unlocks its own doors to readers?
Well, I mean, what happens in the end of the story is Joyce is gardening, and that's significant because her parents were farmers, or her ancestors were farmers. I forget if it's her parents, but she earlier has told Ricky that this is hard work. And that's the whole thing about moving from the country to the city, right? It's like you might give up the hard work and live an easier life in a certain respect, but you also have to deal with all these other things when you move into a city. So she in some ways is maybe through the story thinking about how to be a better person, and is maybe making up her mind to tell Ricky that she can't have any more children. And of course, ironically, losing 1 and 2 back to back after losing Adam again, right? So even though no matter what she tries to do for her children and her people, you can't do everything. And so she's gardening, and Clovis runs up and says that Ricky's picking on Santiago's picking on Humphrey again. Down on the corner, and Joyce is walking to the corner and hears a couple pops and sees Humphrey stumbling backwards, which earlier in the story we learn is how it's going to be referred to a character when they're high. They're going to be stumbling, and so she thinks maybe he's just high, and she helps set him down on the ground. And at one point Ricky shoots Humphrey a 3rd time, but she helps lay Humphrey down and goes up and slaps Santiago and realizes that maybe she's hurt him because there's blood on her hands. And so at this point she's basically in denial that Santiago would do anything to Humphrey because she thought she'd taken care of that situation. And, she doesn't want her family fighting. And basically, she's talking to Santiago about his business, and Santiago's telling Joyce to stay out of his business. And, at a certain point, Santiago jumps in the Range Rover and drives off, and then she's screaming for Ricky, and Ricky's standing there, and like, then he runs off, and she's basically holding Humphrey at the end. I kind of, to be honest with you, I might voice an unpopular opinion, and that is, I think in certain ways I don't want the story to end like this. Meaning, not that like events play out and they happen like they happen, and like I don't want, Santiago to kill Humphrey. Not like that, but like from a craft standpoint, maybe. In that I think it's something that is going to happen, and that I'm not surprised about, and that maybe it's that I've learned to want surprise more because so many stories are the same, but this story refuses that surprise to go with the obvious because it's mostly interested in the characters and how, well, the characters and the state of DC and all of this shit. Like it refuses to do the thing you think the master is going to do. In this case, the master writer. Like, it refuses that and goes with, like, what actually happens. And so I say it's only unpopular in that, like, I want something different. Not that I need something different or deserve something different. Just that I know it could end differently if Jones had wanted it to end differently. But that by doing this, I think it's more realistic in how the story works. And it does give us more characterization. And it does give us the answers, I think, that I already knew earlier in the story. And it doesn't tie anything up, so to speak, in my mind. It simply is an ongoing saga that is going to continue. And that is why he did what he did. Edward P. Jones.
Yeah. I think I'm going to have to think about if I want it to end like this more. I think you're right that in some ways, right, like there's a real Chekhov's gun going on with Humphrey the entire time. And I think there's a real Chekhov's gun with the potential for Ricky to stay or for something horrible to happen, for the locked doors to become significant. And so it isn't a surprise that this plays out. And in that way, I think part of what works for me about the way it ends is actually that attention to sort of psychological realism about how it plays out. We leap forward in the last...
Oh, yeah, I even forgot that part. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in the last couple pages, we leap forward into the conditional tense, right? She would not ever remember if she heard the two pops before she got to the corner at Oak Street. And then we see it, it's very, there is, I mentioned Greek tragedy earlier. There's something very much staged about the way that all of this comes down. And I think, but also still very realistic, the ridiculousness of what Joyce says to Santiago feels so apt to the confusion of something truly traumatic happening, right? Stop it before you hit somebody, is what she tells the man shooting the gun. And like that in some way she can't process that this isn't a game. And all of that coming home despite that fear becomes so real. And I think also right in that sort of traumatic way, there's both the hyper specifics of memory, that because of all the adrenaline and fear and confusion and the like, this is something I don't see regularly happen. This is something that's going to be permanently damaging. the inability to capture it clearly and to repeat it or to form memories out of it that feel narrativized sort of coherently. And then we leap back into the past in a single paragraph that's on its own at the end. I won't read all of it, but it leads in with, it was well after dark when the police left her house, and when they had all gone, she called Pearl. In that last paragraph, we learn that Pearl, says she's not going to blame her, but Joyce knows that isn't true. Of course, her oldest son just got shot. That's a hard thing to move past. But we also get this horrifying last line. I've got Ingrid's copy here, and she's underlined it. Then, beginning in the basement, she went about the house undoing the locks on all the doors and windows, for Santiago had no key to her house. And outside that house, there was a very cruel world, and she did not like to think that her child was out there without a place to come to. I think it's such a sad, upsetting last line. It throws us back to it throws me back to the title of the story, which is His Mother's House, as if this were Santiago's story. And Santiago has bought his mother this house, and yet he doesn't have a key. It's not a place he can come to, and she's always locking out the dangerous world. But of course, she's doing that. We're reminded that last time on the back of her common law husband and her son and her sort of adopted son in Humphrey, all these people being the dangerous world out there or the cruel world out there. And I don't know. I think that's, it does. It's a very, very upsetting Greek ending. It is so much shorter and briefer. I think that's true to the way in which I think it feels so true and real, and it lingers with me because it feels true to the experience of trauma and horror in that way. But I take your point, Matthew, that it's almost comforting to go yeah, I kind of wish it ended differently because I'm so upset by the end of this story. But yeah, I think that's why it lingers, is because it's that we get that insight into the future where there's always the whole, and that ending when we come back leaves us in the unknowing, and we never, Jones withholds knowing whether or not Ricky comes back or Santiago ever comes back, and that's some of that writerly mastery of throwing us in the future and then choosing to come back into that past tense where we're left in that ultimate unknown.
Yeah, there's this strange feeling of it's a physical action in the story. It's real world that she opens the doors, but you're sort of metaphorically left to feel like you're invited back into that house and back into the world to look for those characters and see what happens to them, and if they come back and if they don't, and if they forgive and if they forgive in part and then unforgive and get angry, and there's this kind of movement inward and outward at the same time, I think, finally. Should we end there?
Thanks for introducing us to or sharing this story.
Thanks, guys, for treating us so thoroughly.